The year was 2147, and the Saharan exclusion zone stretched for thousands of kilometers in every direction. A sea of golden sand that had swallowed cities and memories, alike Dr. Amara Okonkwo, stood at the edge of the excavation site. Her dark skin covered in a thin layer of dust that the wind seemed determined to apply fresh every few minutes. And she watched the massive drilling machines tear into the earth below. She had spent her entire career studying the secrets hidden beneath the surface of worlds. But nothing had prepared her for the readings that had brought her team to this forsaken place. The satellites had detected something strange 6 months ago. A massive unknown material buried deep beneath the dunes that absorbed every scan and reflected nothing back. And the United Earth Council had sent her team to find out what it was. Marcus Chun, her lead technician, climbed up from the pit with sand in his hair and excitement in his eyes. "We broke through," he said, breathing hard from the climb. "There's a chamber down there, and Amara, you need to see this for yourself." She followed him down into the excavation, past the humming machines and the sweating workers, until they reached a hole in the rock that led into darkness. What she saw when she stepped through made her forget to breathe. The chamber was enormous, carved from black stone that seemed to drink the light from their torches. And in the center stood a ring of metal that rose 40 meters into the air. The ring was made of a substance she had never seen before, darker than night and covered in symbols that twisted and curved in patterns that hurt her eyes to follow. "How old is this?" Marcus asked in a whisper, as if speaking too loud might wake something sleeping. Amara ran her scanner over the nearest symbols and felt her heart stop when she saw the results. "The rock formation around this chamber is at least 200,000 years old," she said, her voice shaking. "But these symbols, Marcus, they are older than any human civilization we have ever discovered." "That is impossible," he said, but his voice carried no conviction because the evidence stood before them, undeniable and terrifying. Over the next 3 weeks, they studied the ring with every tool at their disposal, and every test returned the same impossible results. The metal absorbed all forms of radiation, reflected no light of its own, and registered no temperature whatsoever, as if it existed somehow outside the normal rules of physics. Amara spent her nights staring at the symbols, trying to find patterns, trying to understand what ancient hands had carved these marks and why they had built this impossible structure. She found no answers, only more questions that kept her awake until dawn on the 23rd day. The accident happened. Marcus was taking samples from the inner edge of the ring when his blade slipped and cut deep into his palm, and his blood splashed across the dark metal surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the symbols began to glow. A soft blue light traced along the carved lines, spreading outward from where the blood had fallen like fire racing along a trail of oil. And the entire ring hummed with a sound that Amara felt in her bones more than heard with her ears. "Everyone get back," she shouted, but her team stood frozen, watching as the light completed its circuit around the ring. The air in the center of the ring began to shimmer, rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond. And then it stabilized into something that should not exist, a portal, a window into somewhere else, showing stars that Amara did not recognize against a sky of deepest purple. "What did I do?" Marcus whispered, clutching his bleeding hand to his chest before Amara could answer. Something came through. It was a machine, roughly the size of a dog, floating on fields of energy that made her instruments scream in protest. And it moved through the chamber with purpose, scanning each of them with beams of light that felt cold where they touched skin. Amara watched it record their faces, their equipment, their entire camp, and she understood with horrible clarity what was happening. This was a scout, a probe sent to investigate what had activated this ancient doorway. The machine finished its scan and turned back toward the portal. And as it crossed the threshold, It exploded into a shower of sparks that rained down on the black stone floor. The portal flickered once and then vanished, leaving only the dark ring and the glowing symbols that were slowly fading back to black. It sent a signal, Amara said into the silence that followed. Whatever built this gate, wherever they are, they know we are here now. What do we do? Asked Dr. Sarah Webb, the team's biologist. Her face pale in the dim light, Amara looked at the ring, at the symbols that had been carved by hands unknown in an age before humanity had learned to walk upright. And she felt the weight of what they had discovered pressing down on her shoulders. We tell everyone, she said finally. We tell the council. We tell the governments. We tell the world. Because whatever is coming, we cannot face it divided. Marcus stared at the dark ring with fear in his eyes. You think something is coming? Amara remembered the way the probe had scanned them, clinical and cold, like a scientist examining specimens before an experiment. And she knew with terrible certainty that this was only the beginning. That probe was not just gathering information, she said. It was confirming that we exist, that we activated their gate. And now they will want to know what kind of creatures live on this little world. She turned to her team, to the men and women who had followed her into the desert, seeking knowledge and had found something far more dangerous. The question is not whether they will come, she said. The question is what we will do when they arrive. Outside, the desert wind howled across the dunes, carrying sand that had buried empires and forgotten the names of kings. And somewhere beyond the stars, in a place no human had ever seen, ancient eyes turned toward a small blue world that had just announced its presence to a universe far older and far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. The gate stood silent in its chamber, waiting for what would come next, and humanity stood on the edge of something that would change everything they thought they knew about their place in the cosmos. The sand continued to fall, grain by grain, as it had for millennia. But the world beneath those grains would never be the same again. 3 months had passed since the probe came through the gate, and the excavation site had transformed into the most heavily guarded location on Earth. Amara stood in the command center, surrounded by screens and soldiers and politicians who looked at her as if she held the answers to questions that kept them awake at night. The United Earth Council had taken control of the site within days of her report, building walls and weapons around the ancient ring, preparing for something they did not understand. She had tried to tell them that guns would not help, that whatever had built this gate had technology beyond anything humanity could imagine. But they needed to feel like they were doing something. And so the soldiers kept arriving on the 91st day after first contact. The gate activated again. Amara was reviewing data in her quarters when the alarms began screaming, and she ran through corridors filled with panicked personnel until she reached the chamber. The ring glowed with that same cold blue light, and the portal shimmered in its center like a wound in reality itself. This time, the things that came through were not machines. They were tall, nearly 3 meters in height, with bodies covered in plates of chitin that gleamed like polished armor in the artificial lights. And they moved with the careful precision of beings who had never learned to fear. Their heads were angular, almost insectoid, with compound eyes that reflected the terrified faces of the soldiers pointing weapons at them. There were 5 of them, and they stood in perfect formation, showing no concern for the guns aimed at their bodies. One of them stepped forward and spoke, and his voice came out in clicks and whistles that somehow translated themselves into words Amara could understand. We are the Vethkai, it said. We have ruled 1,000 worlds since before your species learned to make fire, and we have come to discuss the terms of your submission. General Morrison, the military commander of the site, stepped forward with his jaw clenched tight. You are on Earth territory, he said. You do not make demands here. The Vethkai, who had spoken, made a sound that might have been laughter. Your territory exists because we allowed it to exist, it said. This gate is part of a network that spans the galaxy, and your species was never meant to find it. Amara pushed past the soldiers, ignoring the hands that tried to stop her. Why? She asked. Why were we not meant to find it? The compound eyes focused on her, and she felt like an insect being examined by a giant. 60,000 of your years ago, our ancestors evaluated your species, the Vethkai said. They found you to be excessively aggressive, dangerously unpredictable, and unsuited for integration into galactic society. So they quarantined your world and erased all evidence of the gate. You locked us in a cage, Amara said, anger rising in her chest. We protected the galaxy from you, the Vethkai corrected. And now that you have broken quarantine, we must decide what to do with you. The terms they offered were simple and terrible. Humanity would accept permanent observation status under Galactic Compact law, surrendering all weapons technology and all space-capable vessels, and Vethkai administrators would be placed in every major government to ensure compliance in exchange. Humanity would be allowed to continue existing, and if we refuse, General Morrison asked the Vethkai, made that laughing sound again, then we will implement corrective measures, it said. We have done so before with other problematic species, and we will do so again. The delegation left through the gate, giving humanity 30 days to accept their terms. The world erupted into chaos. Some governments advocated immediate compliance, arguing that survival under alien rule was better than extinction, while others prepared for a war they could not possibly win. Protests filled the streets of every city, and humanity turned on itself in fear and anger. But Amara did not care about the politics, because she had noticed something during the meeting that no one else seemed to see. Vethkai had not built the gate. Their technology was advanced, certainly, but it did not match the impossible metal of the ring. And the symbols carved into its surface used patterns that bore no resemblance to anything the Vethkai had shown them. She returned to her research with desperate intensity, spending days without sleep studying the ancient symbols. And slowly she began to see what had been hidden beneath the surface. The symbols were not just decoration. They were a language, layered and complex. And beneath the parts that seemed to describe the gate's function, there was another message, entirely a warning. She worked for weeks to translate it, and when she finally understood what it said, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The gates were not built to connect. They were built to contain something lived in the darkness between galaxies, something that consumed civilizations and erased species from existence. And the gates were part of a prison system designed to keep it locked away. The Vethkai knew this. The message made that clear, and they were using the gates not as their creators intended, but as tools of conquest. They had rewritten history, claimed the network as their own, and used the quarantine protocols to subjugate developing species before they could become threats to Vethkai dominance. They are lying, Amara whispered to herself in the darkness of her lab. They have been lying about everything. She looked at the data on her screen, at the truth that could change everything, and she knew what she had to do. The Vethkai wanted humanity to submit, to bow down and accept their place as servants of an empire built on deception. But humanity had never been good at bowing. She copied her research to a secure drive and began making plans to share what she had discovered with anyone who would listen. The Vethkai had made a mistake when they came through that gate, because they expected to find a species ready to surrender. Instead, they had found humans. And humans had a long history of fighting back against those who tried to put them in cages. The 30 days were counting down, and somewhere in the desert, the gate waited in silence for what would come next. 1 year had passed since the Vethkai delivered their ultimatum, and Earth had become a prison. Their fleet hung in orbit like a crown of thorns around the planet. Hundreds of ships that blocked the sun during daylight hours and filled the night sky with points of hostile light. when humanity refused to fully comply with their demands. The Vethkai had responded with what they called selective enforcement. They destroyed military bases in the first week, vaporizing installations on 6 continents with weapons that turned steel and concrete into glass. And the message was clear. Resistance would be met with annihilation. Satellites fell from the sky. Communication networks collapsed. And the global economy crumbled as trade routes closed and markets crashed. But humanity did not surrender. Amara had shared her discovery with leaders across the world, showing them proof that the Vethkai were not ancient caretakers, but opportunistic conquerors. And that knowledge had spread like wildfire through the underground networks that formed in the shadow of occupation. People who had been ready to submit found new courage when they learned the truth. And resistance movements grew in every nation, hidden from Vethkai surveillance, waiting for their moment in a bunker 300 meters beneath the Nevada desert. Amara stood before a council of scientists and soldiers who had gathered to hear her latest discovery. The symbols in the gate contain more than warnings, she said, displaying holographic images of her translations. They contain coordinates, thousands of them, addresses for other gates scattered across the galaxy. Colonel James Wright, a scarred veteran who had lost half his command in the first wave of enforcement, leaned forward in his chair. Other gates means other worlds, he said. And other worlds might mean allies, or more enemies, cautioned Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a physicist who had been studying the gate technology. We have no way of knowing what we will find. Amara highlighted a cluster of coordinates marked with a specific symbol. These locations are different, she said. They are marked with a sign that appears nowhere else in the archive. And my best translation suggests it means something like sanctuary or refuge. You think these are safe places? Wright asked. I think they were meant to be, Amara replied. And I think they might hold answers about who really built the gates and why. The plan they developed was desperate and dangerous. The Vethkai maintained a monitoring station near the gate, a small facility staffed by administrators who controlled access to the network. And any attempt to dial a new address would require seizing that station. They had one advantage. The Vethkai did not consider humans a real threat after a year of occupation. The aliens had grown complacent, treating their posts on Earth as boring assignments rather than combat deployments. And their security had become routine and predictable. Colonel Wright assembled a strike team from the best soldiers left on Earth, men and women who had survived the enforcement actions and burned for revenge against the creatures who had destroyed their world. They trained for 3 months in secret, learning everything Amara could teach them about Vethkai technology and physiology, preparing for an assault that would either open a door to hope or end in their deaths. The night of the attack was moonless and cold. Amara waited in the command bunker, watching the operation unfold through feeds from helmet, cameras that flickered and jumped as the soldiers moved through darkness toward the Vethkai station. The fighting was brutal. Vethkai weapons turned 3 soldiers to ash in the first seconds of combat, but the humans kept coming, using tactics the aliens had never encountered, sacrificing themselves to create openings for their comrades. Wright led the final push himself, taking a wound that would have killed most men. But he refused to fall until his team had secured the control room. We have the station. His voice crackled through the speakers, thick with pain. But reinforcements are coming. We can see their ships descending. You have maybe 10 minutes before they reach us. Amara ran through the tunnels that connected the bunker to the gate chamber, her heart pounding in her chest. Carrying the data drive that contained the sanctuary coordinates, she reached the ring as the first. Vethkai ships appeared on the horizon, their weapons charging with the glow of imminent death. The control panel accepted the coordinates she entered, and the gate roared to life, its blue light filling the chamber as the portal opened to reveal a sky of violet clouds and crystalline towers in the distance. Go! Wright's voice screamed through her earpiece. "We will hold them as long as we can." Amara turned to face the team of scientists and engineers who had followed her. The 12 men and women who had volunteered to step into the unknown. "Whatever we find on the other side," she said, "it has to be better than staying here." She did not wait for responses. She simply stepped through the portal and felt reality twist around her as she crossed the distance between stars in a single heartbeat. The others followed, one by one, until the last of them vanished into the light behind them. Colonel Wright and his remaining soldiers stood their ground against the Vethkai reinforcements, buying precious seconds with their lives, fighting not for victory, but for the chance that those who escaped might find something worth dying for. The gate closed just as the Vethkai breached the chamber, and the aliens stood staring at the dark ring with something that might have been confusion. The humans had escaped, fled to a destination unknown, and for the first time since they had arrived on Earth. The Vethkai did not know what would happen next in orbit. The fleet commanders received reports of the incident and felt something they had not experienced in centuries of conquest. Uncertainty and on a world impossibly far from Earth. Beneath a violet sky, Amara stood among ruins that had waited millennia for someone to find them. And she knew that the fight for humanity's future had only just begun. Amara walked through fields of crystal flowers that chimed softly in the wind, past towers of pale stone that rose toward a sky painted in shades of purple and gold. And she felt like an intruder in a temple that had been abandoned by its gods. Her team had arrived 3 days ago, stumbling through the gate into a world that seemed frozen in time, and they had found no living beings. Only machines that still functioned after countless millennia. The machines were kind in their way, providing food and water and shelter, responding to the needs of their unexpected guests with silent efficiency, as if they had been waiting all this time for someone to care for. Dr. Hassan Rashid, the team's linguist, had been working around the clock to decode the archives that filled the central tower. Vast libraries of information stored in crystals that glowed with inner light. "I found something," he said on the 4th day, his voice trembling with exhaustion and wonder. "Amara, I found everything." She gathered the team in the archive chamber, where holographic displays showed images of beings unlike anything they had ever imagined. They were tall and slender, with bodies that seemed made of living light, and their faces held expressions of profound sadness that transcended the boundaries of species. They called themselves the Aethery, Hassan explained, and they built the gate network over 1,000,000 years ago. The story he told changed everything. They thought they knew the Aethery had been explorers, traveling the galaxy in search of other intelligent life. And they had found it everywhere they looked, species of every shape and form. Civilizations at every stage of development. They had been happy in those early days, building the gates to connect the worlds they discovered, creating a network that allowed ideas and cultures to flow across the stars. But then they found something else in the void between galaxies. In the darkness that separated island universes, there lived something that had no name and no form. A presence that fed on conflict and grew stronger with every act of violence. The Aethery called it the Silence, because wherever it touched, all voices eventually stopped it, had discovered the gate network and used it to spread, infecting civilizations with whispers that turned friends into enemies and allies into murderers, feeding on the wars that followed until nothing remained but empty worlds and dead stars. The Aethery fought back with every weapon they could devise. But the Silence could not be killed with weapons, because every act of violence only made it stronger in the end. They found only one solution. They redesigned the gate network, turning it from a system of connection into a system of containment, creating barriers that locked the Silence in the spaces between galaxies and quarantined, developing species until they could be prepared for the truth, and then they sacrificed themselves. pouring their own life energy into the seals that held the silence at bay. Becoming one with the gates they had built, the Vethkai were supposed to be caretakers, Hassan said, his voice bitter. The Aetheri chose them to maintain the network and guide younger species when they were ready. But instead, they used the quarantine protocols for conquest. Amara stared at the images of the Aetheri, at the beings who had given everything to protect the galaxy that would never know their names. What about the silence? She asked. Is it still contained? Hassan's face went pale. The seals are weakening, he said. The Aetheri designed them to be maintained, to be strengthened by the cooperation of all species in the network. But the Vethkai never did that. They kept everyone divided and fighting. And now the barriers are failing. How long do we have? The archives estimate perhaps a century before total collapse. But the silence is already pushing through in some sectors, worlds going dark. Entire civilizations vanishing without explanation. The final message in the archives was addressed to whoever found it. A recording made by an Aetheri in the last moments before their sacrifice. The being's voice was gentle, despite the weight of what it carried. We have failed, it said. We built walls when we should have built bridges. We hid the truth when we should have shared it. And now we leave you to face what we could not defeat. But we also leave you hope. The silence cannot be fought with weapons, for it feeds on conflict, but it can be starved. It can be weakened by unity and cooperation, and the choice to build rather than destroy. We quarantined your world not because you were dangerous, but because you show potential, because in all our studies of your species, we saw something rare, a capacity for both terrible violence and profound compassion, a will to survive that borders on madness, and a stubborn refusal to accept defeat, even when all logic says you should surrender. You are chaos incarnate. And chaos is what the silence fears. Amara listened to those words and felt tears running down her cheeks. Tears for the Aetheri who had died so long ago. Tears for humanity who had been locked away for their own protection. Tears for a galaxy that had been built on lies. But beneath the grief, she felt something else hope. The Aetheri had seen something in humanity worth saving. And now humanity knew the truth, and with that truth came responsibility. She turned to her team, to the tired and frightened humans who had crossed the stars on faith. We have to go back, she said. We have to tell everyone what we learned here, not just Earth, but every species the Vethkai have been keeping in the dark. The Vethkai will try to stop us, Dr. Tanaka said. Let them try, Amara replied. And her voice carried a conviction that surprised even her. We are the chaos they did not account for. She began downloading the archives to portable drives. Every record, every coordinate, every piece of evidence that proved the Vethkai had been lying for 100,000 years. The war for the galaxy had begun, and humanity would not be fighting alone. Amara stood at the center of a vast assembly hall on a world called Nexus Prime, surrounded by beings from a dozen species who had gathered to hear her speak. And she marveled at how far they had come since that day in the desert when Marcus Chen had cut his hand on an ancient ring. Her hair had gone gray in the years since then, and her face carried lines that told stories of battles fought and friends lost. But her eyes still held the same fire that had driven her to uncover the truth. About the gates, the Vethkai Empire was crumbling, not because humanity had conquered them with weapons, though there had been fighting, terrible fighting that had cost millions of lives on both sides, but because the truth had proven more powerful than any army. Amara and her team had traveled through the Gate Network, visiting quarantined worlds and sharing what they had learned, showing the evidence that the Vethkai had been lying for 100,000 years. Some species had refused to believe them, too frightened of their masters to risk rebellion, but others had listened to Kethrani, a race of aquatic beings who had been enslaved for generations. had risen up against their Vethkai administrators within weeks of learning the truth, the Morthic. Massive creatures of stone and fire, who had been told they were too primitive for freedom, had broken their chains and joined the growing resistance one by one. The quarantined species of the galaxy had awakened to the reality of their situation, and the Vethkai had found themselves facing not a single enemy, but thousands. The Empire had tried to crush the rebellions with force, but their fleets were stretched thin. Their administrators were overwhelmed, and the lies that had held their power together were dissolving faster than they could replace them. And now, for the first time in galactic history, representatives of free species had gathered to discuss what came next. Amara stepped forward to address the assembly, and silence fell across the hall as hundreds of alien eyes focused on the small human woman who had started a revolution 5 years ago. She began. My people discovered a gate buried beneath the sands of our world, a gate that connected us to a galaxy we never knew existed. The Vethkai told us we had been quarantined because we were dangerous, because our species was too aggressive and unpredictable to be trusted. And they offered us a choice, submit or be destroyed. We chose to fight, not because we wanted war, but because we knew that a life lived in chains is not a life worth living. And we believed that somewhere in this vast universe, there had to be something worth fighting for. She looked around the assembly, meeting the eyes of beings so different from herself that they might as well have been dreams made flesh. We found it, she said. We found you. We found species who had been told the same lies, who had been kept in the same cages, who had been taught to believe that they were alone and helpless and small. And we found the truth about what the Vethkai were really hiding. The holographic displays activated, showing images of worlds that had gone dark, sectors of space where the silence had breached the ancient barriers and consumed everything in its path. This is the real enemy, Amara said. Not each other, not the Vethkai, but the thing that lives in the darkness between galaxies. The thing that feeds on our conflicts and grows stronger with every war we fight. The Aetheri knew this truth 1,000,000 years ago, and they gave their lives to give us a chance. But that chance means nothing if we waste it fighting among ourselves. She paused, letting her words sink in. The silence cannot be defeated with weapons, she continued. It can only be starved, weakened by unity and cooperation and the choice to build instead of destroy. The Vethkai understood this, and they were afraid, because they knew that if the species they had enslaved ever learned to work together, their empire would collapse, and they would have to face the silence without their armies of subjugated soldiers. They kept us divided because our division was their strength. But we are divided no longer. The assembly erupted in sound. Voices raised in languages Amara could not understand. But the emotion behind them was universal. Hope, determination, and something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine unity. She waited for the noise to subside before continuing. I am not asking you to forget what was done to you, she said. I am not asking you to forgive the Vethkai or to pretend that the wounds they inflicted have healed. I am asking you to choose what happens next. We can spend the next century fighting over the ruins of their empire, settling old grudges and building new ones, until the silence breaks through and consumes us all. Or we can do something that has never been done before in the history of this galaxy. We can work together. She looked at the assembly one final time, and her voice carried the weight of everything she had learned, everything she had lost, everything she still hoped to save. The Aetheri saw something in humanity that made them believe we were worth protecting, she said. They saw chaos, yes, but they also saw potential. The capacity to adapt, to survive, to find hope in the darkest places. I believe that potential exists in all of us, in every species represented in this hall, and I believe that together, we can become something the silence has never faced. Not an empire, Not a collection of subjects bowing to a single master, but a true coalition, bound by choice rather than force, united by hope rather than fear. The war against the silence will be long, and many of us will not live to see its end. But our children will, and their children after them. And one day, they will look back at this moment and know that this was when we chose to fight for something greater than ourselves. She stepped back from the podium. Her part finished, the assembly voted, and the coalition was born in the years that followed. Human engineers worked alongside Kethrani scientists to develop new technologies. Human soldiers trained Mortheg warriors in tactics that had served them well against the Vethkai. And human diplomats navigated impossible negotiations between species who had been taught to hate each other for generations. It was not easy. And there were failures. And there were days when Amara wondered if they had started something they could not finish, but they kept going. Because that was what humans did, and on Earth. In the chamber beneath the desert where it all began, the gate pulsed with constant light as travelers from across the galaxy came and went. No longer a prison door, but an open hand. Reaching out to a universe that was finally ready to reach back, Amara returned there one last time, years later. When her body had grown too old for travel, and her work was passing to younger hands, she stood before the ring that had changed everything. And she remembered Marcus Chun cutting his hand. Remembered the fear and wonder of that first moment. Remembered all the sacrifices that had brought them to this point. The symbols still glowed softly, and she liked to think that somewhere within them, the Aetheri were watching. Finally, at peace. "We did it," she whispered to the ancient builders. "We found each other, just like you hoped we would," the gate hummed in response. Or perhaps that was just the wind moving through the chamber. But Amara chose to believe it was something more outside. The desert stretched toward the horizon, golden and eternal. But it no longer felt like a place of endings. It felt like a beginning, and somewhere in the darkness between galaxies. The silence stirred and felt something it had never felt before. The first cold touch of fear,